それでは、今から、イベントを始めていきたいと思います。皆様、こんにちは。本日はオンラインイベント、反人種差別、フェミニズムと、脱植民地主義の交差点を考えるにご来場いただき誠にありがとうございます。本日は私、ソヒと酒井功が主催にて、イベントの司会をさせていただきます。また、Q&A セッションにて逐次翻訳をしていただくメリー・ジョイスさんにも本日はお越しいただいています。今日は人種差別、家父長制などの社会的課題が交差している植民地主義について、来場者の皆様と学び、考え、脱植民地化を見直すことで、ディスカッションやを行うことを心待ちにしております。本日は時間の関係により、パリス准教授のレクチャーまでのイントロダクションは日本語で行う予定です。英語表記はスライドおよび Zoom のチャットにてご提供いたします。また、本日のアーカイブ視聴動画も後ほど、提供するため、イベントは終始録画しております。レコーディング内に来場者の皆様の参加の様子が映りますので、Zoom のカメラのオン・オフはご自由にご対応ください。ご理解のほどよろしくお願いいたします。はい、それでは本日のアジェンダはこちらです。まずは私たちのプロジェクトと私たちについて、このプロジェクトを通して何を行いたいのかというのを簡単にご紹介します。その後、本日のメインイベントでもあるLaRose Parris教授の講演と質疑応答にて、パリス教授との交流も設けております。はい、私たちソヒとIsao Sakaiは、植民地主義について共に学び考えるプロジェクト Decolonize Futures 複数形の未来を脱植民地化するを立ち上げて、それからそのプロジェクトの一環としてマガジンを制作しています。私、ソヒは在日コリアン当事者として民族的アイデンティティ、またアジアパシフィック圏内での生活を通して、教育の構図や言語的支配、そして植民地化の歴史との交差性に気づきました。酒井功はFridays for Futureなどで活躍する、気候アクティビストとして気候変動の根本にある原因を探っていく中で、植民地主義との関わりである文化の抹消や帝国主義との関係性に気づきました。こうしたさまざまな格差や差別の実態と植民地主義的原理が共通した関係性を持っていること、そして脱植民地化の必要性が届いていない現状に直面したことがきっかけで、今回のプロジェクトの立ち上げに至りました。プロジェクト脱植民地化についてなんですけど、複数形の未来を脱植民地化するですね。このプロジェクトでは、日常や社会問題を過去の歴史や実情とともに包括的に学びながら、植民地主義の構図、そして現状を考察することで、より多くの皆様と、異なる未来の可能性を一緒に考える場を作ることを目的としています。プロジェクトの一環として、先ほど申し上げた通り、現在マガジンの作成も主に行っておりまして、本日のパリス教授によるレクチャーの様子もマガジンの一部として掲載することを予定しています。
はい、それではまず本日の登壇者であるLaRose Parris教授についてご紹介したいと思います。パリス教授はニューヨーク一律大学リーマンカレッジのアフリカナ研究の准教授として、アフリカやカリブ海の哲学であったり、黒人の方々のフェミニスト研究などを教えられています。今回のイベントの事前課題として送らせていただいたパリス教授の著作 Being Apart はカリブ哲学協会によるニコラス・ギレン賞という優秀作品に贈れる賞を受賞しています。で簡単にですね、今回このパリス教授をお招きしてこのイベントを開催するにあたったきっかけとして、私、酒井功が今年の夏にアメリカで参加したカリブ哲学協会のサマースクールがありました。で気候変動解決の根本に脱植民地主義の必要性があると知ってから、たまたま大学の恩師に誘ってもらったことがきっかけでこのサマースクールに参加をしました。でこのなぜカリブ哲学なのかっていうと、この後パリス教授からさらに詳しくお話があるんですが、植民地時代にアフリカから奴隷として連れてこられた人々が最初にたどり着き、最も奴隷支配に対して抵抗が行われた地域の一つとしてカリブ海諸島があった。 ということがあります。その地域の人々にとっての哲学を学ぶことが脱植民地化と深く結びついているとサマースクールで学びました。パリス教授とは、ここの写真にはちょうどさっき書いちゃったので写ってないんですけど、サマースクール中にたまたま隣の席に座った時にほんの少し話した程度だったんですが、ぜひこの方に日本のオーディエンスの方々に向けて脱植民地化のことを話してほしいと直感で感じました。本日はこのような機会を実現することができたことを本当に嬉しく思っています。はい、今回のイベントでは、ジャムボードというプラットフォームを使って Q&A だったりインタラクティブセッションを行っていきたいというふうに思っています。これから、まずラローズ教授のレクチャーを聞いた上でですね、質問したりということのセッションに入っていくんですが、ぜひ質問などがインタラクティブセッションが行う際には、ぜひ皆さんカメラをオンにしてご参加いただけると大変嬉しく思います。はい、それではちょっと一回このジャムボードの、を使ってですね、一回練習も兼ねて皆さんに一個、答えていただきたい質問があります。こちら見ていただくとわかるかもしれないんですが、ジャムボードのページの一番最初にですね、脱植民地化、植民地主義に関して、植民地主義、コロニアリズムと聞いて浮かぶ言葉、イメージは何ですかという質問が書いてあります。一度ジャムボードの方に、画面を切り替えさせていただきます。はい、こちら見えているかなと思います。今、チャットの方に、ソフィーの方からお送りさせていただいたんですが、ジャムボードへの、招待リンクがあります。はい、皆さんにこちら、パソコンで入られている方は入りやすいかなと思うのですが、こちらにリンクで入っていただいて、この植民地主義と聞いて思い浮かぶ言葉、イメージがあれば、ぜひこちらに書いていっていただきたいなと思います。で、書き方なんですが、ここの横のバーに行っていただくと、ここの、メモのようなマークが出てきます。で、ここを押していただくとスティキーノート、メモ帳が出てくるので、ここに、このような形で書いていただくと、メモ帳が出てくるという形になっています。はい、もうすでに書いていただいている方もいるかもしれませんが、はい、ぜひこちらに皆さんが思う考えをバババババッと書いていただきたいなと思います。はい、後ほどそれを踏まえた上で、ラローズ教授にも、どういったイメージを皆さんが持たれているのかっていうようなことを、お伝えできるかなというふうに思っています。はい、それでは今から約2分ほど取りたいと思うので、ぜひ皆さん書いていっていただきたいと思います。よろしくお願いします。すみません、エラーの表示が出ているということで。なるほど。ちょっとエラーが出てしまっている方は、Zoom のチャットに送っていただいたら、僕たちが代わりに記入するようにするので、はい、アクセスできない方は、Zoom のチャットに送っていただければ幸いです。
はい、今ご来場いただいた方にも、ジャムボードを送らせていただきたいと思います。少々お待ちください。
はい、ありがとうございます。もうかなりたくさんの方に書いていただいて、そうですね、白人至上主義だったり、ヨーロッパ中心主義、プリミティブな文化の否定、資本主義、帝国主義、奴隷制度、土地のland acquisition、cultural imperialism、文化帝国主義だったり、パワー構造、パタナリスティック、すごくたくさんの考えを書いていただいています。 はい、ありがとうございます。後ほど、これはですね、ローズ教授も見ていただいているので、これを踏まえた上で、どういった、イメージを皆さんが今持たれているのかということを、お伝えできればなというふうに考えています。はい。それでは、もう一度スライドの方に戻ります。はい、それでは、ちょっと前段が長くなってしまったんですが、これから、The Intersection of Anti-Racism, Feminism and Decolonization、反人種差別、フェミニズム、そして脱植民地化の、交差点というテーマで、ラローズ・パリス教授に、レクチャーをお願いしたいと思います。事前に、ちょっと早めにイベント参加していただいた方にはお伝えしてはいたんですが、今回、翻訳に関してですね、より正確にラローズ教授の、レクチャーの内容を、より詳しい、正確なコンテキストで皆さんにお伝えしたいということで、ライブでのレクチャーではなくですね、事前にレコーディングした動画に私たちが、翻訳した上で字幕をつけた映像を皆さんにご覧になっていただきたいと思っています。はい、それでは今から画面共有させていただきます。はい、で念のためですね、このイベント、レクチャーは、録画になるんですが、ラローズ教授は、ご参加いただいているので、レクチャーの後に Q&A セッションで答えをいただけます。はい、それでは始めさせていただきます。
Good evening. Thank you all for being here. My name is LaRose T. Parris, and I'm honored to give you this talk today. And what I'm going to be doing is sharing my screen so that we can begin the presentation. Now, before beginning, I would very much like to thank Sohee and Isao Sakai for their generous and diligent translation work. Without them and all of their determination, we would not be able to meet here to have this important discussion. Today's talk is the intersection of anti-racism, feminism, and decolonization. And let's begin. So, the importance to fully understand the current anti-racism and decolonial movements today, we have to look back, first of all, to the 20th century. And during the mid-20th century, we witnessed the decolonization struggles, the wars for liberation in what was then called the Third World, Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean. These nations threw off centuries of European colonialism in the 1950s and through to the 1970s. So it's important to understand that. And that movement is best represented and exemplified by the Bandung Afro-Asian Conference. And as you can see here, I've begun the presentation with a Korean thinker named Jong-un Annabelle Wee, who wrote an article called The Spirit of Bandung Beyond Coloniality. And in that article, she makes the very same argument that today's activists need to embrace the spirit of the Bandung Afro-Asian Conference, which was centered on anti-colonialism, anti-imperialism, and anti-militarization. So to clarify Bandung, I'm just going to show you a brief clip on the Bandung Conference, and I'm going to narrate because it's a silent clip. Okay, so here we go. A landmark event for anti-colonialism on April 18th through the 24th of 1955, leaders of African and Asian countries gathered in a historic meeting in Bandung, Indonesia, known as the Bandung Conference. And this is the actual footage. The meeting brought together revolutionaries from around the world who condemned Western imperialism and colonialism. It aimed to promote Afro-Asian economic and cultural cooperation and to oppose colonialism and neocolonialism. 29 countries participated, which represented 54% of the world's population, more than half. The conference came to be a landmark event on anti-racism, anti-imperialism, anti-colonialism, and anti-militarization that laid the ground for important international forums, such as the Non-Aligned Movement created in 1961, and the Group of 77, G77 in 1964, okay? So that is to show you the actual footage from the event so that you can see how truly radical Bandung was at that time. Now, in Jong-on Annabelle Wee's article, she makes the very strong argument that liberalism and fascism are not oppositional ideologies. Neither liberalism nor fascism has any commitment whatsoever to anti-racism. In fact, Jung Annabelle Wee argues that liberalism and fascism keep the colonial hierarchy intact. And we're going to talk about what the colonial hierarchy is, okay? But suffice it to say that Jung Annabelle Wee cites a range of thinkers, including Aimé Césaire from Martinique in the Caribbean, and Takeuchi Yoshimi, a Japanese thinker, who also talks about the Japanese colonial fascist project in Korea, Taiwan, and China. Okay, so that is to begin. We look at the 20th century struggle for decolonization, the wars for liberation that overthrew centuries of European colonialism. Now, to move on, we have here, I just wanted to show you this map, and I'm just going to minimize for a moment. This map is to give you an idea of just how vast European control globally has been for the past 5 centuries. Okay, if you look at the map, all of the countries in green were either colonized by Europe or under European control. Of course, there's one exception. There is one mistake. Ethiopia, right here in the Horn of Africa, was the only country to evade European colonialism. There was a series of wars between Ethiopia and Italy in the early 20th century, the 1930s in particular, and they were able to maintain national sovereignty. Okay, but so when you see this map, you have to understand that Europe gained such power and dominance. And the question that the slide asks is, what catalyzed the Bandung Conference? How are colonialism, slavery connected to racial hierarchies and white supremacy? The answer to those questions is through the imposition of Euromodernity. Now, Euromodernity is a specific form of modernity that refers to the emergence of the Euro-modern world. And Europe ascended as a global superpower in the 1490s with the age of contact, conquest, and colonization. During that period, from the 1490s all the way into the early 20th century, the European colonial project defined global relations. And that was done through the development of a specific ideology, and that is called scientific racism. The only way that Europeans could dominate and dehumanize, subjugate, and enslave so much of the world's populations, as well as exterminate the indigenous populations in the Americas, the only way that could be done for so long was through the development of a way of thinking that positioned Europeans as the so-called superior race, and all other races were positioned beneath them. That is the racial hierarchy that was part of the colonial project and the slavery project, okay? Now, scientific racism is the use of science and philosophy by Western thinkers to justify racist practices and policies, okay? And to clarify scientific racism, I'm going to show you one clip and then Harvard University's webpage on scientific racism. So first, here is a clip of a graduate student from the University of Cambridge talking about scientific racism and his research.
This Native American skull was collected from the battlefields of the Second Seminole War in the mid-1830s. The neat bullet hole provides a lasting reminder of what happened to those who fought to defend their homeland in 19th century Florida. This is just one of 78 illustrations of native North and South American skulls featured in Samuel George Morton's Crania Americana, published in Philadelphia in 1839. It is undoubtedly the most important book in the history of scientific racism. The 19th century was a period in which science was increasingly used to justify racist ideas. In a claim typical of these developing racial sciences, Morton wrote of Native Americans that the structure of his mind appears to be different from that of the white man. The idea that Native Americans could not integrate into modern industrial society was central to both Morton's argument and also President Andrew Jackson's Indian Removal Act. From the passage of this act in 1830 onwards, Native American people, including the Seminoles featured in Crania Americana, had been forcibly relocated to the west of the Mississippi River. Within a few years, Crania Americana had been read in the United States, Britain, France, Germany, Russia, and India. James Cowles Pritchard, the foremost British anthropologist, described it as an exemplary work, whilst Charles Darwin also considered Morton an authority on the subject of race. My research here at the University of Cambridge looks to explain how Crania Americana became so influential, not just in the United States, but in Europe and beyond. How could a book with a print run of just 500 copies make such an impact? This research is crucial for understanding the ways in which racist theories gain credibility.
Okay, so that is to give you an idea of just how common,
Particularly in Europe, scholars tend to...
of just how common this way of thinking became. And it still continues today, unfortunately. And I want to show you how, for example, Harvard University is seeking to rectify or correct some of these past ideologies that their own faculty members participated in the 1800s. So here is Harvard University's, this is a page from Harvard Library, and it's a Confronting Anti-Black Racism resource. And they do so by indicating the importance of looking back at the history of racist thought. So I just want to show you two brief paragraphs. One of the most effective tactics used to justify anti-Black racism and white supremacy has been scientific racism. Through the years, scientific racism has taken many forms, all with the goal of co-opting the authority of science as objective knowledge to justify racial inequality. Some 19th century scientists, like Harvard's Louis Agassiz, were proponents of polygenism, which posited that human races were distinct species. This theory was supported by pseudoscientific methods like craniometry, the measurement of human skulls. That's what you saw in the last video, which supposedly proved that white people were biologically superior to Blacks. Okay, so there you have it. Many institutions like Harvard University and even Brown University are now dealing with their very complex history that relates to both slavery, colonialism, and scientific racism. Now, this last link I'm not going to play. You can watch this on your own. This is about Carl Linnaeus as the father of biological classification. And he wrote a book in the 1730s called Systems of Nature, and he classified plant life, animal life, and human life. And he was one of the first to create a racial hierarchy that positioned Europeans as the superior race, Native Americans, Asians, and Africans all below the European. And again, you can watch that on your own. But I'm trying to give you an idea of how and why European colonial domination continued for so long, because volume upon volume of books, thousands of books written by people, for example, like Immanuel Kant, Physical Anthropology, George Hegel, Lectures on the Philosophy of World History, David Hume of National Characters, wrote books and essays all about the supposed superiority of the European, all to justify centuries of domination. Moving on to the 19th century, which you heard a little bit about in the last video. Now, one of the other questions that Sohee and Isao asked, how do slavery and colonialism connect to patriarchy? And the answer to that is in the 19th century anti-slavery struggle and women's rights struggle, okay? So this is very important to understand. Although patriarchy is very much implicated in slavery, colonialism, and women's oppression, not all white feminists of the 19th century, who were also known as suffragettes, not all white feminists believed themselves to be commonly oppressed with Black people. They did not think they needed to share in the struggle for liberation with Black people. Instead, many white feminists actually sought to share power with white men. So they were not trying to overthrow patriarchy, many of these women. They wanted to share in patriarchal power, okay? And that is reflected in a quote by Elizabeth Cady Stanton, in which she says, "I will cut off this right arm of mine before I will work for the ballot for the Negro and not the woman." Right there, she is declaring her white privilege, okay? Now, in contrast to Elizabeth Cady Stanton, I'm just going to minimize. This is Elizabeth Cady Stanton. This is Sojourner Truth and Frederick Douglass. Both Sojourner Truth and Frederick Douglass were not only anti-slavery activists, also women's rights activists, because they had more expansive thinking about freedom. They understood that freedom should be given to every individual, or not given, taken by every individual, okay? And I'm going to play you a very brief clip of Sojourner Truth's famous Ain't I a Woman speech, and it's read by Kerry Washington, who some of you may know.
In 1851, the Black abolitionist and former slave Sojourner Truth spoke to a gathering of feminists in Akron, Ohio. The spontaneous speech, only a few minutes long, was a landmark moment in feminist and abolitionist history.
Well, children, where there is so much racket, there must be something out of kilter. I think that twixt the Negroes of the South and the women at the North all talking about rights, the white men gonna be in a fix pretty soon. But what's all this here talking about? That man over there says that women need to be helped into carriages and lifted over ditches and to have the best place everywhere. Nobody ever helps me into carriages or over mud puddles or gives me any best place. And ain't I a woman? Look at me. Look at my arm. I have plowed and planted and gathered into barns, and no man could head me. And ain't I a woman? I could work as much and eat as much as any man when I could get it. and I can bear the lash as well. And ain't I a woman? I have borne 13 children, seen most sold off into slavery. And when I cried out with a mother's grief, none but Jesus heard me. And ain't I a woman?
Okay, that is to give you an idea of how powerful Sojourner Truth's message was, that freedom could not be defined by sex or race, that every person deserves to fight for their freedom. And in fighting for that freedom, get the right to vote. And Frederick Douglass had a similar point of view. He is quoted as saying, right is of no sex, truth is of no color. Okay, now to connect the institution of colonialism to the anti-slavery and women's rights struggles, we have the example of the Haitian Revolution. Now, the Haitian Revolution, you have to understand, created the first free Black nation in the Western Hemisphere in the late 1790s and early 1800s. This was unprecedented, okay? And again, I'm going to play you a very short clip by a professor at Brown University named Anthony Bogues, talking about just how radical the Haitian Revolution is. And he also, again, talks about the role of bourgeois or wealthy white women in France who were so invested in the colonial fantasy that they would actually send their clothing from Paris to be washed in a river in Haiti. So you see how they were involved in the colonial project. So here briefly is Anthony Bogues.
I want you to think of the world in 1794. Everywhere you look, there's slavery in the Atlantic world. Everywhere. North America, Caribbean, Latin America, particularly Brazil. There is no anti-slavery movement that has succeeded in these places. Plantations are the order of the day. Saint-Domingue is considered the pearl of the Antilles. It is the richest plantation and the richest colony in the end.
Okay, Saint-Domingue was the French name for the entire island of Haiti, which is shared with the Dominican Republic, but the entire island was called Saint-Domingue in French.
Entire colonial world. Everybody knows about it. The Dutch know about it. They have newspapers that write articles about it. The British write newspaper articles about it. Newspapers in Scotland were writing about it. The German newspapers were writing about it. Everybody was preoccupied because this was the richest colony of the world. This was the Antilles. This was the colony that I would argue that the colonial fantasy existed upon, to the extent where rich women from Paris would send their clothes to be washed in Saint-Domingue in a certain river because it had a certain quality in it. I mean, the fantasy that existed at that moment. So then you think of that world, and then think of the slaves then getting rid of slavery in 1794. And then think of the reverberations of that across the world. It created what became known as the Haitian Fear. That is, we could not have this again. Napoleon made it absolutely clear. He said the key to what is happening in Saint-Domingue, the colony, is not the commercial success, is not economics, is not even politics, he says. He says we have to get rid of the specter, and here I quote him, the specter of the blacks. What's the specter of the blacks? The specter of the blacks is black sovereignty and against slavery. So you think, therefore, how that revolution shakes up the entire world, a world built on colonialism and a world built on slavery. And then you ask yourself, okay, if that is so, what is the most important revolution of this period? Is it the French Revolution that declares rights of citizenship? Citizens and equal rights, but continues a colonial project? Not just in the Caribbean, but also in parts of Africa? Is it the American Revolution of 1776 that continues, that does not get rid of slavery, but just talks about political independence? Is it the English Revolution of 1648, in which parliamentary democracy is established? Or is it the Haitian Revolution, the dual Haitian Revolution, in which what? In which the question of slavery, which was the dominant form of domination of people in the Atlantic world, is gotten rid of. Is that not the most important and radical revolution of the period? And it is done by formerly enslaved people.
Okay. So there was Anthony Bogues talking about how truly radical the Haitian Revolution was. And now that we've been talking about the legacy of European colonialism that lasted for 5 centuries, in the midst of those, within the 3rd century of that domination, enslaved Africans overthrew not only the system of slavery, but the system of colonialism in Haiti. So this is why the Haitian Revolution must be acknowledged as the most radical revolution. Now, moving forward.
はい、すみません。ちょっと一回、ストップしたんですが、今、だいたいレクチャーの半分ぐらいに来ています。で、おそらく皆さん、初めて学ばれる方もいれば、とてももうすでに知っている方もいらっしゃるかもしれないんですが、おそらくかなりとても新しい情報だったり、多くの情報が今のレクチャーの中でお伝えされてたと思うので、一回それをある意味ちょっとプロセスするタイミングを取りたいなというふうに思っています。もう一度先ほどの、ジャムボードの方に行っていただきたいなと思います。はい。ちょっと一回スライドを出しますね。はい。一回、もう本当に今思っていること何でもいいので、レクチャーを聞く中で考えていること、もやもやであったり、新しく学んだことをアウトプットするでも全然構わないですし、気づいたこと、わからない点などを一度ジャムボードに書き出していただきたいと思います。約5分ぐらい取るので、その間に皆さんジャムボードに書いていただきたいなと思います。また、さっきのようにアクセスできなくなってしまった方は、チャットの方に送っていただければ、それを主催者側が、翻訳してジャムボードに載せたりとか、できるので、お願いしたいと思います。はい。はい。で、皆さんに書いていただいた後に簡単にラローズ教授からコメントいただきたいと思っています。So now we're going to have a short Jamboard session. So the people would put the thoughts or any realization or any questions on the Jamboard. So and we will translate the sticky notes so that the LaRose can read and make a comments after that. はい、なので皆さんが書いたノートの下に書き終わり次第ですね、僕たちが翻訳をつけてラローズ教授が読めるようにしていきたいと思っています。もし日英どちらもできる方がいらっしゃいましたら、日本語、英語どっちもで書いていただくとすごく教授が読みやすいので、やっていただけるととても助かります。はい、それでは約21時40分、43分を目安に書いていただきたいと思います。よろしくお願いします。すみません、大変失礼しました。ちょっと1個、アナウンスで伝えそびれていたんですが、このジャムボードに新しいページがあります。この上の部分を見ていただくと2ページに飛べるので、先ほどの1ページはもうめちゃくちゃいっぱい書かれているので、2ページ目のところに、気づきだったり、もやもやを書いていただきたいなと思っています。はい、お願いします。 はい、それではそろそろ時間になるかな、あと1分ぐらいかなというところなんですが、まだ書いている方は書きながらで大丈夫です。結構読んでいると、ハイチ革命のことを知らなかった、聞いたことがなかった、学ぼうと思わなかっただったりだとか、スピーチの力強さが印象的だったり、日本で過ごしていると先ほどまでの話を実感を持って聞くことが難しいっていう、すごくある意味オネストなコメントありがとうございます。クレノメトリー、頭蓋骨の、サイズで測るのは日本の帝国大学の学者たちも行っていたであったり、はい、皆さん本当にたくさんのコメントありがとうございます。So, LaRose, could you had a chance to take a look at the comments? Sorry, it's quite a lot, but
Yeah, it's
if you
okay.
find any some notes that you like that draw your
Yes.
attention.
Yes. The first one I'd like to address is the one that states in Japan, it's hard to have a sense of reality connected to this talk. What I'd like to emphasize is that when you share this PowerPoint, it's very important on the third slide to listen to the link on Carl Linnaeus, because in that link on scientific racism, Linnaeus has his categories of different races of humans, including Homo sapiens Asiaticus. You need to listen to how European thinkers created the basis of the stereotypes of Asians. That would draw you in more. Also, Jung-un Annabelle Wee's analysis of Bandung is very important, because in that article, and I can share that article, maybe we can set up an email listserv, and I can share that article with all of you. She talks about Takeuchi Yoshimi's analysis of the Japanese colonial project. So I understand that some of this might not resonate for some people, but that's when you have to go forward and look at the links that are included that mention Asians, as well, I will forward the article to a listserv. But it's important too, to really try to see yourself as a global citizen. Because if you care, you're here because you care about these issues. So even though you think it might not relate to you personally, it does. Just even on the level of some of the content on the slides, but also in terms of how you perceive other people of color. So I would say that you have to push yourself a bit more and not just say, well, the presentation is not about me. Well, if it's about humanity, it's about you. That's my response to that. There was another question.
Maybe I'll translate that one
Yes.
first, and we'll go one by one, maybe.
Okay.
では今のコメントを通訳します。まず一番最初に、この話を聞きながら、日本で過ごしているとあんまり実感が湧かないですとか、自分との関係についてのコメントがあったので、それについてまずコメントしたいと思います。ぜひ最初に強調したいのは、パワーポイントの中で3枚目のスライドの中ではカール・リンネさんについての紹介があったんですけれども、今ちょっと時間の関係で動画そのものをお見せしなかったんですけれども、ぜひ後でそのリンクをクリックしていただきたいと思います。そこでそのサイエンティフィック・レイシズム、その科学的な人種差別というところは、ヨーロッパの当時の学者がどういうふうに各人種の人たちを見てたということの中で、アジア人に対するヨーロッパの人たちの考え方、見方ということがその中には紹介されていますので、この文脈の中でアジアの人々はどういうふうに見られていたのか、どういうふうに今も見られているのかについて、その視点からぜひそのリンクをちょっと見ていただきたいと思います。そしてパワーポイントの一番最初のスライドにもコリアンアメリカン韓国系のジョン・アナベル・ウィーさんのという学者の論文を紹介しているんですけれども、彼女そのバンドについての記事ぜひ皆さんに読んでいただきたいと思います。後で記事そのものも多分メールなどで紹介することはできると思うんですけれども、彼女の中でその竹内義美さんの分析について紹介をしています。で、それが日本の植民地主義がこの文脈の中でどういう意味を持つのかなどについて てのことが書かれていますので、日本とどういう関係があるのかについてもう少し知りたい方はぜひその記事を読んでもらいたいというふうに思います。でもし今の話が、ちょっと自分とはそこまで関係ないといいますか、まだあまり響いてないという方はぜひもう一歩そのリンクを読んだりですとか、ではその中でアジアはどういう意味を、どういう位置にあるのかについてぜひ考えていただきたいと思います。でそこで重要なのは、自分はやはりそのグローバルシティズン、その地球市民という観点からぜひ聞いてほしいというふうに思います。これはある人間と関係するものであれば、それはもちろん自分とも関係するんだ。もうどの人にとってもそれ関係するものだというような視点でぜひ考えてみたいと思います。でそれが自分にどのような影響があるのかということもそうですし、自分が他の人をどういうふうに見てるのか、他の人のことをどういうふうに考えているのかということも必ずこれは関係してきているので、ぜひそのようなことからもう一歩ちょっと踏み込んで、ぜひ一緒に考えていきたいと思います。Thank you, LaRose. Please go ahead.
No, thank you very much, Mary. There was another Jamboard comment that stood out. Was colonial ideology and racial justification the only reason for colonialism? What about saving people from a primitive society and transitioning them to a civilized society? That's a wonderful point. What this person is mentioning actually is the mythology of the noble savage, that while certain indigenous cultures were quote unquote primitive according to Europeans, that there was a certain nobility in that simple way of life. However, yes, that was a justification for colonialism as well, because in European and Western thinking, the advanced societies, quote unquote advanced societies, needed to bring in these more primitive people so that they could acclimate, they could adapt to what they viewed, once again, as a superior way of life. The reason I keep using the phrases superior versus inferior is because this was the thinking, that a primitive way of life was inferior, when in fact, think about the way we now understand talking about, for example, ecological issues and veganism. All of these different ways of thinking that we now in the 21st century claim are more in line with saving the planet. These are ways of thinking that so-called primitive people were degraded for living close to the land. Native Americans, for example, never killed an animal without blessing the animal first, blessing its spirit, thanking the animal for giving them sustenance. That was something that the European colonizers laughed at. But now today, as people who are more conscious of climate disaster, of the ecological chain and having more sustainable ways of life through perhaps not eating animal meat, through veganism, now people look back at that and say, wow, Native Americans were ahead of their time because they never wasted any part of the animal. Waste is something that is very central to modern, so-called modern neoliberal societies. There's something called extractivism, which just means taking and taking and taking from the earth and never giving back. And extractivism never happened during so-called primitive Native American societies. So when we think about technological advancements and societal advancements, those go hand in hand with destruction and waste. And that's something that primitive, quote unquote, primitive people never did. So yes, part of the colonial project was debasing primitive cultures, labeling them as backward, claiming that people needed to be brought into more advanced societies. And when we say advanced, we mean in terms of capital, in terms of consumption. And those ways of life denigrated not only the Earth's inhabitants, but the planet as well. So I hope that's clear, Mary. Okay, because I'll stop there.
もう一つ、この質問を読んでいて気になったというか、ぜひコメントをしたいというのが、この植民地主義を正当化する理由の中では、その人種的なこと以外に、例えばそのプリミティブな社会をまた文明化に持ってくる、文明を紹介していくなどというコメントもあったかと思うんですけれども、そのようなそのプリミティブな社会、プリミティブな人たちをその文明の社会の方にしてくるというような考え方が、当時からもかなり一つの正当化する理由としては主流のものとなっていました。で、その方法としては英語でノーブルサベージという言い方があるんですけれども、その野蛮人というサベージをまたノーブルという非常に素晴らしい人に変えていくというような考え方が当時からあったんですね。で、それは植民地主義、そしてその構造、その制度そのものを正当化していくための一つの理由だったんですけれども、やはりいわゆる、当時考えられていたプリミティブな人たちをより優れた社会、優れた生き方、優れた生活に同化していくというプロセスの中で、その理由としてはされていました。で、それがやはり、植民地をされる側の人たちは優れていないという考え方で、こちらの社会、こちらの生活の方に変えていくということで、それで、superiority、inferiority という英語の単語をあえて使うんですけれども、それは優勢、劣勢ですとか、優れている、優れていないという意味なんですけれども、それが今の例えば環境のことなど考えると非常にリンクしている考え方にはなります。今はですね、この21世紀には例えばその環境のことですとか、ビーガンになる、動物食べないですとか、そのような考え方は、私たちにとって地球を救うためには必要なことであるというふうに言われているんですけれども、当時はそのようなことはプリミティブなやり方で、それはその本当にダメな人たちしかやらないというようなことで当時は考えられていたんですね。しかしそれが例えばアメリカ大陸の先住民の人たちを考えると、当時は本当に例えば必要な時に動物を殺す時には必ずそのスピリッツにお礼を言ってから、感謝をしてからその動物を殺していただくっていうようなことが習慣としてはあったんですね。で、それが当時のヨーロッパの植民地をしていく人たちにとっては本当にそれを笑ってしまうような、もう本当にダメな行動だというふうに当時は言われていたんですけれども、今の私たちが生きている時代ですと、例えばその気候の危機を意識している人たちだと、そのエコロジーのチェーンですとか、持続可能な生活、そしてその私たちの地球をどういうふうに守っていくというためには、やはりそのような考え方が今すごく重要というふうに今されてきているんですね。で、今になると、やはり昔からの先住民の人たちの考えというのは本当に必要な考えだったんだというふうに今は、認識といいますか気づかれているようなことがあるんですけれども、当時はもう全然違うことだったんですね。で、それは一つのそこで大事な概念というのはその、ウェイスト、無駄にするということですけれども、そのいわゆる今の現代の新自由主義の社会の中では、物を消費して無駄にしてしまうということがすごく一つの根本的なことにはなっているんですね。それが今エクストラクティビズムという英語の、割と新しい言葉があるんですけれども、それは物を抽出主義といいますか、その抽出して搾取して使用してしまう、消費してしまうということなんですけれども、それはまたもう本当に取ってもらって何も戻さない、何も返さないということで、それが本当に地球を破壊していくということです。で、それがプリミティブな人たちだったら絶対そういったことはしない。それが一つの植民地主義のプロジェクトそのものの根本的なことにはなっています。ですので、それがその資本ですとか消費ですとか、それが本当に今地球の人、そして地球に住む人々、そして地球そのもののために大事だとされてきているものは当時、昔からはプリミティブだというふうに考えられてきたというような背景があります。
Okay, thank you so much. Yes, yeah, thank you so much, LaRose, and thank you so much, Mary-san, for the translation. I think you're going to talk more in the lecture about epistemic decolonization and in depth about the details. So I would love to kind of jump back to the lecture. But thank you so much. はい、皆様ありがとうございます。それでは一度レクチャーの方に戻って、続きのレクチャーを残り半分見ていきたいと思います。はい、で先ほどラローズ教授が、メンションされていた、リンクだったり、に関しては、先ほど、チャットでお送りしたスライド から、アクセスしていただけるので、そこからご覧ください。
Forward, I'm briefly going to talk about decolonial philosophers of the 20th century. And we have here Edward Blyden from the Virgin Islands and Liberia in Western Africa. We have here Frantz Fanon from Martinique, also in the Caribbean, who later relocated to Algeria. Aníbal Quijano from Peru, and Lewis Gordon. So when we talk about decolonial philosophy, we have to understand it as a development, as an ideological development that takes seriously and prioritizes the principles of decolonization. While the other slides talked about the geographical decolonization, the reclaiming of native sovereignty by the indigenous peoples of Africa, Latin America, the Caribbean, and Asia, the wresting of control to govern their own countries by eliminating the rule of the European colonizer through self-determination, through wars for liberation. That is in the physical sense. But decolonization also has a psychological element as well as an epistemological element, meaning the production of knowledge. So what do I mean by that? This is Edward Blyden here. And Edward Blyden in the 1860s, he was a philosopher, okay? And in the 1860s, he called for the establishment of African universities. Why did he call for that? Because with colonialism, with physical colonization of a territory, comes the establishment of European colonial institutions in that colonial territory, meaning a European educational system, particularly. And what do colonized subjects, African, Caribbean, Latin American, and Asian colonized subjects learn about? They don't learn their own native histories. They are brainwashed into believing in the superiority of the colonizer's history. And I'll give you an example. My family is from Jamaica. My parents grew up in Jamaica under British colonial rule. They had to memorize all of the different British royal houses, the Tudors, the Plantagenets, etc. They also learned about the sonnets of William Shakespeare, William Wordsworth. They learned purely British history. For them to learn their own native history was mainly through the oral tradition, meaning the stories from their elders, their parents, their grandparents, about, for example, the slave revolts of Queen Nanny of the Maroons. So a colonial education, and Edward Blyden knew this, creates race poison. It tries to convince the colonized that they are inferior, that they are savage, without culture and history. And later in the 20th century, Frantz Fanon described that as alienation, because one becomes a stranger to oneself under colonialism. The imposition has that psychological element that prevents the colonized subject from having true knowledge of self. And he explores that in his two books, Black Skin, White Masks, and The Wretched of the Earth. In Black Skin, White Masks, he uses a range of Western thought, existential, Marxist, and psychoanalytic, to challenge the colonial situation. Aníbal Quijano wrote a specific article in 2000 called Coloniality of Power, Eurocentrism, and Latin America. And in it, he argues that when formal colonialism ended through the wars for liberation, there still remained unequal power dynamics. And he termed that coloniality. Why? Because Europeans maintained socioeconomic as well as cultural dominance, not only in Latin America, but throughout the world. Socioeconomic dominance can be understood through the mechanism of debt, for example. The International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, who issue these loans to the poorer nations of the global South, maintain control over their economies through debt and through dependence on loans, okay? Then if we talk about cultural dominance, the sphere of European influence is global, and that even relates to something like beauty standards. For example, the epidemic of skin bleaching that is, in not only in the Caribbean and Africa, but in Latin America and Asia as well. People seeking to lighten their complexions to appear more white or European in appearance. Okay, again, the psychological dimension of European domination, which is coloniality. And then finally, we have Lewis Gordon, who writes extensively about epistemic decolonization, meaning decolonizing systems of knowledge and knowledge production so that all thinkers, for example, the thinkers here in this slideshow, that their intellectual productions will be deemed, will be valued, recognized, and acknowledged to be just as important as the intellectual productions of European thinkers like Karl Marx, like Sigmund Freud, like Immanuel Kant. That to decolonize epistemology means that, excuse me, European dominating influences must be eliminated so that we have an equal representation of how all people, regardless of race, have contributed to the history of ideas and the development of humanity. So the next slide, I'm just going to show you a brief clip on Lewis Gordon talking about, very brief, his book. It's called Freedom, Justice, and Decolonization. And here he is.
Alito, Shalom, Hotep, Machiavanakan. Hello, I'm Lewis Gordon. I'm the head and a professor in the philosophy department of the University of Connecticut. And I'm also honorary professor in the Unit for the Humanities at Rhodes University in South Africa. I'm part of the Decolonial Summer School at the University of South Africa. I'm also the honorary president of the Global Center for Advanced Studies, and there are a variety of other things, of which there is also my position as the chair of public philosophy for the American Philosophical Association. Now, I mention these not to basically just talk about the positions I have, but they're highly relevant to this book. The last one particularly, public philosophy. One of the enduring allegories in philosophy is from Plato's Republic. Now, philosophy didn't begin in what we know as ancient Greece. Actually, in the book, I talk about, at a certain point, nearly 1,500 years of philosophy before the pre-Socratics or ancient Greek philosophers. And that is because I actually begin the book with talking about philosophers who dealt with public problems and reflections on wisdom and knowledge in ancient East Africa. I begin, for instance, with Antef, one of the ancient African philosophers. But I bring up Plato's Republic because Plato's Republic talks about what it is to be imprisoned in a cave of falsity, a cave of misinformation, a cave of disinformation, shadows. In fact, given what this country, the United States, has gone through under the Trump administration, we know what it's like to be living under the perils of misinformation, disinformation. And we understand this in what happened on January 6th, when that misinformation affected people who, many of whom are highly educated people, in some cases, people who have no real reason for grief and bad judgment in the society. They're acting in many cases on misinformation, disinformation, and of course, there are always those who are willfully ignorant.
Okay, so that is to give you an idea, excuse me, of Lewis Gordon and how he uses philosophy to get people thinking about reality, about social and political issues, excuse me, and also about decolonizing our understanding of who exactly and what peoples and what cultures have contributed to philosophy. And in several of his books, I'm going to move forward, he talks about the fact that philosophy did not begin in Europe. Many of you know that for example, the ancient Chinese philosopher Confucius predates Socrates by hundreds of years. And so this is another question that Sohee and Isao asked me to answer, is how do scholars, present these suppressed histories? And my answer to that was by challenging Eurocentrism and patriarchy. So here in the first three thinkers, we have Enrique Dussel, Lewis Gordon, who you saw, and Martin Bernal. And what all three of these thinkers talk about is the fact that the framing of Europe as the center of the world, as the source of all human achievement, that narrative, they emphasize, was part of a larger colonial project, specifically that during the 18th and 19th centuries, at the height of African racial slavery, also known as chattel slavery, the height of European colonialism, and during the genocide of Native Americans, European thinkers had to fashion Europe as the sole engine of human progress. So to do that, what did they do? They suppressed the histories of people of color and or erased those histories. And one of the histories they erased was that of ancient Africa. And these, again, Gordon, Dussel, and Bernal talk about ancient Egypt as the source of Greek civilization, that the ancient Egyptians were the teachers of the ancient Greeks. And they provide the archaeological and historical evidence, also linguistic evidence, to show that Egyptians were an African people, not just by living on the African continent, but culturally and even physically, that the ancient Egyptians ranged from light brown to dark brown like me. So the challenging of Eurocentrism is central to decolonial philosophy. Also central to that is the challenge to patriarchy. And I'm going to talk about that more in the next slide on decolonial feminism. But to begin, I just want to alert you to two thinkers. This is Anna Julia Cooper, who in 1892 wrote a book called A Voice from the South, in which she examines race-based and gender-based oppression. She was also a highly respected educator. Gordon also contextualizes her as an Africana philosopher in his book, An Introduction to Africana Philosophy. Here we have Angela Davis, who's still living and with us. Very important philosopher and political thinker. Her groundbreaking text, Women, Race, and Class, examines 19th century African American women through their political activism, their agency, and institution building. So she's very central to when we talk about what decolonial feminism is. On the next slide, we're also going to talk about more of her work. So moving forward, we have decolonial feminist philosophers. And these are women thinkers who actually analyze and challenge capitalism, racism, slavery, and patriarchy in their works. And even though we are using the term decolonial now in the 21st century, we have to understand that there were many thinkers, just like Edward Blyden, who you saw before, and Frantz Fanon, who were ahead of their time. And that includes Rosa Luxemburg, who right here, who was a Polish socialist revolutionary. And she was instrumental in the rise of socialist revolution in Europe, in particular, the Russian Revolution. And before her assassination in 1919, Rosa Luxemburg wrote a letter to all of us, and she called us her future comrades. So I'm going to play you a clip in which her words are read by someone else. And in this letter, she talks about the fight for freedom, justice, and equality. And just a brief clip.
Dear my future comrades, to those who can hear me, I say no, I cannot go on working. The thought of you keeps distracting me. I must write you a few words. Dearest, most beloved. You're not with me now, yet my entire soul is filled with you, and it embraces you. My entire life was a never-ending fight. From a very young age, I had to fight my physical disabilities so I could walk myself to school. I had to fight the norms of how a girl should behave, to pave my own path carefully to a higher education. And to love. But happiness was never an option. How could I be happy when my people were suffering? How could I be happy when there was war rampaging the world? How could I be happy when I look into the future and all I can see is just the gloomy light of destruction? Destruction of freedom. Destruction of humanity. So I write to you now, my future comrades. My life may end, but our fight will never. Never until we free us all.
Okay. And the reason I like to discuss Rosa Luxemburg, because she stands in opposition to other white middle class or bourgeois feminists. Rosa Luxemburg was, we would consider her white, but she did not believe in white privilege. And it's to show you that not all white people are committed to white supremacy. And she is a shining example of that. She wrote two very important pieces, Martinique and The Proletariat Woman. And in them, she expresses an allegiance to Global South solidarity and an antipathy for European imperialism, which she described as European capitalism gone awry, okay? So she saw that connection. And she also called bourgeois feminists, white bourgeois feminists, useless. She called them parasites because all they wanted to do was feed off the exploitation of people of color and working people. Moving forward, again, we have Angela Davis, who in the 1970s, again, many decades before decolonial philosophy was acknowledged, wrote two important pieces, Lectures on Freedom, in which he discusses Frederick Douglass as a philosopher, and reflections on the role of the Black woman in the community of slaves. And she coined the term matrix of oppression, which people use all the time now to talk about race-based oppression, gender-based oppression, and class-based oppression. So again, we see how these women are connecting capitalism, patriarchy, and racism, and colonialism. And lastly, we have Françoise Verger, who in 2021, her book, A Decolonial Feminism, was published. And it's a really great work. And in it, Verger talks about the fact that she was inspired to write the book when she witnessed a strike of women workers of color at the Gare du Nord train station in Paris. And she opens the book by saying, "Who cleans the world?" Meaning so many unacknowledged poor women, women of color, who are affected by capitalist exploitation, racism, and political oppression. And so she weaves that all together once again, to critique white feminism and white feminists who participate in the colonial and racist projects, okay? So those are the decolonial feminist thinkers, and we can talk more about them when we, in the Q&A. And to wrap up, this is the final slide on anti-racist and decolonial activism. And I chose all of these images for a reason, because they all reflect in their wording everything we've talked about. To decolonize means to reclaim not only our land, but our minds, our societies. And it also means to reimagine a better future, which is why we are all here. And of course, white supremacy kills people and the planet, okay? And of course, Black Lives Matter. And finally, here's a quote by an indigenous American woman: "Ni la tierra ni las mujeres somos territorio de conquista," which just means, for those of you who don't speak Spanish, neither the earth nor women are territories to be conquered. So all that means is that decolonial anti-racist activists are seeking a reordering of the global power structure, one that acknowledges the humanity of every single human being, where we can all live with freedom, dignity, and self-respect. And, you know, I look forward to us talking more during the Q&A. Thank you very much. And once again, thank you for being here.
Hi, ありがとうございます。Thank you so much, LaRose, for a wonderful lecture. So, はい、それでは今からQ&A セッションの方に入っていきたいと思います。We would like to jump into a Q&A session. はい、それでは、また先ほどのようにメリーさんにも翻訳で入っていただきます。で、最初にですね、残りあと10分ほど、当初予定していた時間が10時半までということになっているのですが、少しイベントが終わる時間をちょっと遅らせて、Q&A の時間をできればなというふうにも考えております。はい、ラローズ教授も10時半以降も少し余裕があるということなので、はい、続けることになると思います。はい、で、先に出なきゃいけないという方はですね、後ほど、参加者の方全員にアーカイブの動画をお送りいたしますので、そこはご心配なく大丈夫です。はい、それでは、先ほど、質問がある方からですね、ぜひこの、パートはカメラオンにできる方はオンにしていただいて、していただいたりだとかですね、質問がある方は、Zoom のこのリアクションの部分ですね、挙手機能を使って、手を挙げていただきたいなと思います。喋るのが難しいという方いらっしゃいましたらですね、先ほどの、ジャムボードの方に、はい、失礼します。こちら、4ページ目に飛んでいただくと、Q&A セッション用の、質問を書く部分がありますので、もしあったらこちらに書いていただくようお願いします。はい、何か質問ある方がいらっしゃったら手を挙げるようお願いいたします。そうですね、ちょっと時間がかかるかもしれないので、最初にラローズ教授にコメントをお願いしたいなと思います。So, LaRose, do you have anything to add on to the lecture regarding the Jamboard session that we just had a while ago?
Sure. There were a few points that I didn't get to address, so I'll address those now. One was on exoticism and how that connects to the issue of racism, racial hierarchies. So that's an excellent question. When we think of exoticism, we have to understand the implications of the Western gaze, meaning the gaze of the European towards people of color. And the Western gaze is very important because it's not only destructive, but it also diminishes the humanity of people of color. And I can give a specific example of that. In the 1800s, there was something very popular in Europe and the United States, and this was actually called human zoos, okay, where different people, indigenous people, African people, some Asian people, were collected as people would collect zoo animals and displayed as examples of primitives, of others. So that Western gaze not only dehumanized people of color, but it exoticized people of color. Many people think exoticism is positive because you think about beautiful physical characteristics, but exoticism is also rooted in the more denigrating elements of the Western gaze, whereby someone is not seen as fully human. Just because you think someone's attractive doesn't mean that you're engaging in that person's intellect, that person's moral belief system, that person's cultural and cosmological understanding of the world. You're merely basing it on the physicality. And to reduce someone to their physicality is a form of diminishing their humanity, because you're not engaging with every aspect of their being. So exoticism is problematic. While some people again think, oh, well, at least I'm valued for my looks. Do you only really want to be valued for how you look? Don't you want to be seen as a full and complex human being with thoughts, ideas, with positions, with intellect that can contribute to how we view humanity and how we view intellectual ideas, etc.? So exoticism is problematic, and it's not always a positive thing, because again, it's still rooted in 19th century race science, the objectification of different racial groups, etc. Okay, so I wanted to address that. Go ahead, Mary, if you go ahead. Thank
Sure,
you.
I'll do up until there. まずその Q&A に入る前にいくつかコメントの方でエグゾティシズムということについて、何か物事をエグゾチックなものとして考えるということについての質問があったので、それについてぜひコメントしたいと思います。で、ここではそのウェスタンゲイズ、その西洋の眼差しという考え方がすごく大事だと思うんですけれども、特にその、西洋の有色人種の人たちに対する眼差しというものはものすごく破壊的なもので、その人間性そのものを否定してしまう、それをもう小さくしてしまうというような危険性のあるものだと思います。ですごく具体的な例を一つ挙げますと、1800年代、19世紀にはヨーロッパとアメリカですごい人気があった、一つのエンターテインメントとして人気があったものが人間の動物園というものだったんですね。で、それは本当に先住民の方々ですとかアフリカの出身の方々、アジアの人たちを集めて動物のように展示をするというようなことが本当に人気なものとしては存在をしていたんですね。で、それをプリミティブなものとしてエグゾチックなもの、その他のものとして展示をしていくということが当時はあったんですけれども、それが本当にその人間性そのものを否定してエグゾチックなものとして考えるということだったんですね。今エグゾチックっていう単語を聞くとすごく美しいものだったりポジティブなものとして考えるそのような響きがあるかもしれないんですけれども、本来はそうではなくてエグゾチックなものであるということはもう人間ではない、その人間性そのものを否定してしまうというようなことがあります。で、ある意味でそのエグゾチックは美しいものだったらいいんじゃないかということがあるかもしれないんですけれども、もちろん誰もその見た目という美しさだけではなくてその人が持っている考え方だったり文化的な背景だったりその知性だったり感情だったりそのようなことで全て包括的にもちろん見てほしいということが誰もが思っていることだと思います。でもしそうじゃなくてその他の本当にエグゾチックなものとして見るということはその全体を否定してしまう、全体を見ないということになってしまうんですね。ということですごく問題のある考え方概念だと思います。もちろん私たちは自分の見た目だけではなくてもう複雑なアイデアをたくさん持っている、社会にも貢献ができるさまざまな知恵を持っている人として見てほしい ということがあると思います。ですので、それが19世紀の時には人種に基づいてその科学に基づいたような考え方として考えられていたんだけれども、それが本当にエクゾティシズム、そのエクゾティックなものとして見るというのは本当に非常に危険な考え方であるということを強調したいと思います。Thanks, LaRose.
Thank you. Thank you very
Yeah.
much. If I could just add, I'm sorry, I know that you
No
saw me
worries.
looking at my phone. I wanted to give you some titles because if you Google books about human zoos, a lot of books come up. And one book in particular says The Human Zoo, The Invention of the Savage. So again, it's connected to that discourse of the noble savage, etc. And all of those books talk about the human zoo as part of the colonial project. So I just wanted to emphasize that as well. Go ahead, Isao.
Yeah, so I see some hand and also some questions in the Jamboard. So
Okay.
yeah, maybe so maybe Kai-san, maybe you can talk in Japanese or in English as you prefer. どっちでも大丈夫です。
どっちがいいかな。Thank you for your presentation. I have a question on the suppression of thoughts and events in the non-Western world, say the Haitian Revolution, and many other philosophers and thinkers you mentioned in the presentation. My question is, how can we liberate these events and these thoughts, and how can we connect those events in the mainstream discourse of how we understand universal values such as freedom and rights?
That's a great question. And I thank you for that question. The way to do it, I think, is for all of us to share the knowledge and information that we get in these sorts of gatherings with others, particularly those who are teachers. One of the things that's very important in the educational system, especially in the United States, I'm talking about in this context, is that the disciplines tend to be very rigidly formulated. And in making the boundaries so rigid, it prevents an exchange and proper sharing of this type of information. For example, in American history courses or American literature courses, you're not given information or readings on Frederick Douglass, on Sojourner Truth. You might only get a paragraph on slavery, when in fact you could teach an entire course, not just on slavery, but on how enslaved people resisted in terms of slave revolts, but also resisted in their thinking, in their speeches, and in their writings. So it's very much a project of expansion that needs to take place. We cannot separate American history from African American history. We cannot separate the history of revolution from the Haitian Revolution, but that is what continues in particular in this educational system. So educators in particular need to broaden how they view and how much Eurocentrism affects their own teaching and curriculum. And they need to bring in the relevance of Black history, Caribbean history, especially as it pertains to the Haitian Revolution. And I can give you an example. When C.L.R. James wrote the book, The Black Jacobins, and that's considered the classic study of the Haitian Revolution. When he wrote it, in his introduction, he says that this book will be taught alongside all great studies of revolution. He was very optimistic because the Haitian Revolution is not taught along all great studies of revolution. They teach about the French Revolution, the American Revolution, the Russian Revolution. Those are the three main revolutions. Okay, they're not teaching about the Haitian Revolution in those courses. They're not teaching about the war for liberation in Algeria. They're not teaching about any revolutions outside of the Eurocentric focus. So what we have to do is get and inspire and awaken educators to this need to see the development of revolution as a human phenomenon. And as a human phenomenon, that means that revolution has impacted every race of people on every corner of the globe, not just the European. So it's really important that we spread this information, and especially to people who have an audience, teachers, political thinkers, you know, people who have a widespread audience, and then the information keeps getting spread more and more. So first we have to alert people and awaken their consciousness, and then get them to share the mission, because it is a mission. Thank you for that question. I'll let Mary do her thing.
Thanks.そうですね、これはやはり考え方ですとかイベント、歴史的な出来事などが抑圧されている中で、それをどういうふうにもっと共有していくのか、考えていくのかということについて、まずやはりそれを自由なものにしていくのかということをメインストリームにしていくというのは、すごく教育が大事だということです。やはりまずは例えばこのようなセッション、このような場で学んだこと、感じたことなどをまず周りの人たちにシェアしていくなどということが大事で、その中でやはり学校の先生ですとか何か教える立場にある人たちの役割というのがものすごく大事だと思います。アメリカの文脈で考えますと、一つのすごく問題になっているのが、教育制度の中で一つ一つの科目がすごく別のものとして考えられているということがあるんですね。歴史は歴史、文学は文学で、その境界線も絶対に入っていかないというようなことが教育の制度の中にあるということがあるんですけれども、やはりその境界線をもっと緩いものにしていき、さまざまな考え方、さまざまな分野などの情報の共有、その交換などというものがすごく大事だと思います。例えばアメリカの場合ですと、歴史の授業、文学の授業の中ではフレドリック・ダグラスですとかソジョーナ・ツルスについてほとんど学ぶことがないんですね。奴隷制について学ぶことがあるとしたらも本当にワンパラグラフぐらいしか出てこないというのが今の歴史の、状況なんですけれども、本来であればそれがもう本当に数ヶ月の一つの科目でもそれを奴隷制そのものについてだけではなくて、それに対して抵抗した人たち、それどういう形で抵抗していったのか、それがどういうようなスピーチをしたのか、どういうものを書いたのかということを、それだけでも一つの授業になり得るんだけれども、それがもう本当に出てこないというのが一つの問題です。ですので、やはりその教育の中でそれをもっともっと拡大していくプロジェクトが必要だと思います。今はアメリカの場合ですと、アメリカの歴史とアフリカンアメリカの歴史を一緒にしていかなければいけないですし、革命の歴史の中では今はヨーロッパ中心に教えが、という形でやることが多いんですけれども、革命の歴史の中では必ずハイチのことも学ばなければいけないですし、ヨーロッパ中心の考え方よりもその黒人の歴史、カリブの歴史、特にハイチの革命を教えていくことが必要だと思います。で、ハイチの革命について一番クラシックとしてされている本はブラック・ジャコビンズというジェームズによる本なんですけれども、彼が書かれた時に、これは全ての人たちが革命について学ぶ時には必ずこの本を読むようになるでしょうというふうに言われていたんだけれども、それはかなり楽観的な考え方で、残念ながら今やはり革命が教えられる時のフランス、アメリカ、ロシアだけになってしまうという傾向があるんですね。ハイチについてもアルジェリアについても欧米以外の革命が本当に教えられないという現状がありますので、それをやはり教育者が書いていく必要があります。革命というものは人間そのものの現象であって、それは全ての人種、全ての大陸の人たち、ヨーロッパだけではなく全ての人たちに影響するものであるというふうに教育をしていくことが必要です。で、そういった意味でやはりもっともっと多くの教育者ですとか、やはり自分が何が発信したら聞いてくれるオーディエンスがいる人たちの役割がすごく大事だと思います。まず自分たちで意識をして、そして他の人たちの意識を高めて共有していって、そしてそのミッションを共有していくことが大事だと思います。Thanks, LaRose.
Thank you, Mary.
Thank you so much. So now we have Rino-san and Yuho-san, and then so what we're going to do isじゃあ最初にリノさんに質問して、質問を伺って、一回ジャムボードの方に行って、またユーホさんに戻っていきたいと思います。So, we would come back to Jamboard after Rino-san's question. リノさんお願いします。
Thank you so much. I'm just going to ask it in English. First of all, I love the presentation. I loved the whole thing. Thank you so much for this opportunity. Just kind of going based off of the last question, I feel like decolonization has become more popular, you know, especially within the global, you know, audience. Like a lot more people in Japan are talking about it now, which I think is an amazing thing. But as it becomes more like known in the world, I feel like a lot of people want to join initiatives and do stuff around them. But I feel like it's kind of hard for global audiences, especially in Japan. Thankfully, where I live near Detroit, you know, there's a lot of, you know, protests and committees, stuff that I can just join like every single weekend. But that's unfortunately not the case for many. Especially when it comes to activism, I feel like Eurocentrism is a very big thing, and a lot of the resources are in English. So they have to be translated first, and then, you know, kind of vocabulary becomes a problem there, translation, stuff like that. So what do you suggest, like global allies and, you know, in this conversation, specifically Japanese people, how can we join in on the effort?
Well, that's a really important question. And one of the ways that I think we need to build on, using this form as an example, as you pointed out, is the issue of translation. And in that regard, Isao and Sohee have been just phenomenal. I think what we have to have, just in terms of decolonization alliances, period, we need a large group of people willing and able to translate into as many languages as possible. Because what you're pointing to definitely is an unfortunate bias, but it's a real bias, that people assume that everyone is fluent in English, and they're not. And there's no crime in not being fluent in English. I think the beauty of what we're trying to do is that we're acknowledging cultural and linguistic differences. And by doing that, we can then try to get past those differences by having, you know, just people who are, like I said, ready, willing, and able to translate. That means expanding our circles. That means expanding our circles and forming just coalitions on a basic level, linguistic coalitions. We need that to get this work done in a thorough way. So in addition to translation, we need more forums like this that are enabled by translation. Zoom, thank God for Zoom. I mean, Zoom literally shrinks. We're not even physically distant. I mean, of course we are physically distant, but it's really social distancing that the powers that be want us to believe we cannot have social gatherings. This is a social gathering, despite the fact that we're in different parts of the globe. The powers that be want us to believe that we can't do exactly this, that we can't reach each other, that we can't come to common understanding, that we can't see each other in our full complexity and humanity. They want us to believe that we're completely separate. That's how they keep us separate, if we believe it. So we have to get past that kind of provincial thinking and, like, as you were saying, turn to ways of sharing information, translation, and community. And I know Zoom is not perfect, but it's a definite starting point for building international coalitions. And one of the things that Françoise Verger says in her book, A Decolonial Feminism, is that there's not one solution to solving patriarchy, racism, capitalism. There are many solutions, and we all contribute to formulating those solutions. It's not a unilateral, okay, this is what we have to do this way, only one way. We all have a range of different experiences. We're facing different forms of these oppressive systems. So we all have to contribute to the solution of how to overcome them. And I'm not saying that in a superficial way. I mean that in a very sincere and profound way, that we all contribute. And one of the ways we can all contribute is by having greater linguistic understanding. And you pointed to a really important issue. So we have to, like, I told Sohee and Isao earlier, that if any time someone brings up or mentions the need for a Japanese translator, I'm going to alert them to these two young scholars that I worked with. This is how we build community. I consider myself now, thankfully, because of Sohee and Isao and Mary, part of a community in Asia who are tackling these issues and looking to form alliances. What we seek to do is actually what we are doing right now in this moment. We are the answer, and we have to empower ourselves with that knowledge and not get so discouraged to the point that we feel empty. One of the comments on the Jamboard earlier was, you know, how do I fight this emptiness? That's the enemy. Okay, we have to prevent the enemy at every turn from entering our consciousness and from limiting our reach. We have to believe in the power of ourselves because we all have power. Okay, so you know, the question you're raising is so important on different levels because the answer to what you're asking is right here in this forum. We have to spread the word. We need translators. We have to value and cherish the bonds that we're forming. And I mean that in a sincere way. So thank you for that question. I hope that was clear.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you so much for that. That was very insightful. I'll
Thank
pass
you.
it on
Okay.
to Mary. Thank you so
Yeah.
much.
はい、では通訳します。今の質問をまず簡単に通訳しますと、やはりさまざまその脱植民地ですとか、そのような考え方が少しずつ広まってきているようなことはあるんですけれども、特に日本に住んでいる人たちにとって、それは必ずしも参加しやすいような場面がそれほどなかったりですとか、特にそのアクティビズムですとか、その文脈の中で英語でのリソースがほとんどになってしまうということがあります。やはり日本語でのものが少なかったりですとか、翻訳が必要。翻訳されたとしても、やはりその語彙がちょっと違ったりですとか、日本語では理解しづらいというような状況があるので、そのグローバルなアライの人たちにはどのようなアドバイスがあるのか、特に日本の人たちにはどのような形で、その努力に参加することができるのかということについて、で答えの方はやはり翻訳通訳の大事さというのがまず一つあります。そういった意味でIsaoさんとSoheeさんというのは本当に素晴らしいことを今回この機会で作ってくださっていると思うんですけれども、やはりより多くの人たちがその、翻訳通訳などをしていくことが、能力的にも意思的にもできる人たちをもっともっと増やしていくことがまずすごく大事だと思います。でそれはもちろんなるべく多くの言語にしていくことも大事です。それも残念ながら実際にやはり英語のバイアスというものが今実際の問題としてはあるので、それを乗り越えていくためにはやはり翻訳通訳の大事さが本当にあると思います。で多くの人たちはやはり、英語だったらできるでしょうというふうに考えがちなそういったような傾向があるんですけれども、それが本当にそうじゃないということを我々としてもやはり認識をしていくことがあります。でそれこそがやはりこの文化的な違い、言語的な違いを認めて、それで一緒に手を取っていくということがまさにこの脱植民地主義の中にはすごく重要なことだと思いますので、私たちの輪もそういった意味でもっともっと大きなものにしていくことが大事です。でそういった意味で今回みたいなイベントも一つのすごく重要な機会になります。でそういった意味で Zoom というのがものすごく重要なツールで、やはりある意味で私たちもちろん今離れた場所から参加はしているんだけれども、このようなことがあるからこそ、国境も越えて国を越えて違うところからこの時間この場を共有できることがすごく重要なことです。でやはりその権力のある人たち、その当局などというのはやはり人々を分断させていくことを狙ってやろうとしているんだけれども、私たちがこのような形で自分たちで一緒になってその絆を作っていくということがすごく大事だと思います。でそのやはり考え方を乗り越えていくためにその情報を共有していくこと、交換していくこと、そしてコミュニケーションと翻訳をしていくことが大事です。もちろん Zoom は完璧なものではないんだけれども、それが一つの出発点になると思います。で先ほど紹介したフランスのフランツワ・バージスさんの最近の本の中ではすごく大事なポイントがやはり解決は一つだけではないということですね。それは人種主義も資本主義も過不調性なども乗り越えていくためには様々な方法があって様々なアプローチもあるので、それをどういうふうに私たちの知恵を合わせて様々な方法でやっていくということがすごく大事です。私たちもすべてもちろん違う経験を持っているし、この抑圧の構造の中では違う文脈、違う視点からも物事を見ているので、それすべて合わせて貢献をして乗り越えていくことが大事です。でそれやはり言語というものも一つの手段になります。今回もIsaoさんとSoheeさんにも話したんだけれども、今後もまた日本語の何かニーズがあったときに必ず2人を紹介しますので、今日機会にきっかけにぜひまた広げていきたいと思います。で私自身も も今回、参加させていただく機会があって、こういった形でアジアにいる人たちとつながることができたので、もっともっとこれからも私たちも一緒にやっていくこともたくさんあると思います。私たちこそがこの答えになると思いますし、解決策も私たちが見つけることもできるので、自分のことを疑ったりですとか、そういったことをせずに諦めないで、エネルギーを持ってエンパワーしていくことが大事だと思います。一つのジャンボードのコメントでエンプティという言葉があったんですけれども、それこそが本当に一番、危ないといいますか、私たちの敵になると思います。そういうふうに自分がエンプティである、何もできることがないというふうに感じてしまったら、前に進めることがすごく難しくなるので、意識的にもやはりそのような考えが来ないように元気を持って諦めないで活動していくことが大事だと思います。やはり自分たちを信じて自分たちで行動していく、そしてこのような場でもっともっと伝えていく、行動していく、そしてこういったようなことでまた通訳翻訳などを通じてできた絆、つながりなどを大事にしていくことがこれからすごく大事だと思います。
ありがとうございます。Thank you so much. Yes, so now I would like to ask the kind of like questions from the Jamboard, but although there are quite a few, but I kind of find some similarities in the questions. Also, someone who asked in the chat, but so I see some of the questions ask like how should people in Japan or those people in the position of privilege or the oppressor / colonizer, as written in this question, should be aware or should know or should do in order to tackle this struggle for the decolonization or contribute to the efforts for the decolonization, as well as also someone in the chat, Yurie-san, I guess, asked about how can someone who engages in international cooperation be aware of the how to say, like a violence, or like how to be careful not to kind of like reimpose colonialistic imposition. But yeah, so like what do you think about the question? 質問を簡単に言うと、日本だったり多くの質問に、共通していることだったかなと思ったのでまとめさせていただいたんですが、日本にいる人であったり、それこそ特権的だったり、それこそもともと植民地主義、植民地支配者のポジションにいた、歴史的なバックグラウンドを持っている方々がどのようにこの脱植民地主義の、取り組みに参加すること、貢献することができるのか、その点において気をつけるべきことは何なのか。で、チャットでゆりえさんが聞いてくださった質問にもあったんですが、国際協力っていうことがそれこそある意味、植民地主義をある意味助長することになりかねないっていうこともある中で、どのようにその問題に取り組むべきかっていうことを教えてくださいという質問でした。So yeah, please, LaRose.
No, it's okay. I think the first part of the question about how should someone coming from the side of the oppressor in the Asian context be more aware of when you hear your talk and rethinking decolonization and solidarity. That's related to a second question that says, I think it's very difficult to convince people who are benefiting from the current patriarchy, Eurocentric, or dominant status. How would you approach them? Well, those are good questions, because what they reflect is as someone else mentioned, is a critical consciousness. Someone wrote critical consciousness in the comments, and that's exactly right. To be critical means to be probing and analytical about the extent of the battle we're facing. And yes, you're absolutely right. People who are benefiting from patriarchy, from capitalism, from Eurocentrism, are not going to be necessarily open to this, open to decolonizing the future. However, we're not going to win over everybody. And it's not really necessarily about winning over everybody. It's about raising people's awareness and increasing critical consciousness. And to do that, we are going to be approached, and we will find people who are open. Some people who are on the quote unquote side of the enemy may not want to stay there. The people who are having doubts, the people who, are having issues with their own conscience, they will be open to this kind of thinking. But people who are not, are not. There's nothing we can do about that. But we can have influence over those people who are dissatisfied, who on some level feel that what they are doing is not right. One example, let me think. I think in terms of the United States, there were a couple of articles in the New York Times, for example, about people who participated in the January 6th insurrection, who had remorse. And the main reason they had remorse was because of the death of police officers. There were a few police officers at the Capitol who died because of the violence of that mob. So some people had remorse. Some people, upon reflection, saw the error of their ways, particularly when it came to light that Donald Trump's lies about the election were in fact lies, that the election was not stolen from him. So they could no longer justify their violent actions because more and more Republicans who supported Donald Trump were then changing their opinion about the insurrection and about the election lies. So those are the people, the ones who have remorse, the ones who have second thoughts and guilt and a sense of unease about their role in creating that violence and spreading the lies about the election. Those are the ones in the US context that we can reach. And in terms of the Japanese context, the people that you come into contact with on a daily basis who, express some doubts about, for example, the former Prime Minister Abe, for example, his role in so-called democracy in Japan, even though he was a more reactionary figure, as Isao and Sohee alerted me to, because the American media has been painting him as some, great leader who was for the people, when in fact, he was very conservative. So the people who have doubts, those are the ones we can reach, and those are the ones we have to bring into the cause. We're not going to get everybody. That's the reality of this kind of struggle. I see somebody in the chat wrote something about bell hooks, critical consciousness. Yes, exactly. So I hope that answers the question. We're just not going to get everybody, but we can bring in more people. I firmly believe there are more people on the side of justice than there are on the side of injustice. And we have to believe that if we're going to keep going. And I'll stop there so Mary can.
これはすごく大事な、重要な質問だと思います。で、コメントでもクリティカルコンシャスナスという言葉があって、まさにコメントで日本語でどう説明するのかということがあるんですけれども、直訳しますと批判的な意識などということがあるんですけれども、やはり自分で疑いを持って自分で疑問として考えて自分で分析していくことが大事で、もちろん全ての人たちの意見を変えていくことはできないと思いますし、それが必ず必要でもないと思います。少しでもその疑いを持ってたりとか自分で疑問に感じている人にアプローチしていくことがまさに大事だと思います。でそれがやはり私たちが変えていけることであると思います。それを少しずつその人々の意識を変えていく、上げていく、そして批判的な考え方を持っていくということがまず大事だと思います。でそれをすることによってやはり少しずつそういう人たちを見つけていくということが重要ですね。それももちろん、いわゆる敵側にいる人たちがその中でもやはり自分が立っている側がこれは正しいのかなというふうに疑問に思っている人たちもいると思いますし、自分で疑ったりとか罪悪感感じたりなどという人たちも必ずいると思います。でそういった人たちを少しずつ影響していく、変えていく、 対話していくということが大事だと思います。一つのアメリカの、具体的な例を紹介しますと、去年の1月6日にあった国会議事堂でのその事件で、それに暴動に参加した人たちということが最近ニューヨーク・タイムズの記事で話題になっていたんですけれども、実際にその暴動に参加した人の中で今はすごく反省をしているとか罪悪感があるというふうに言っている人たちがいるんですね。でやはりその日に起きた事件の中ではやはり、本当に亡くなった方はいた、怪我をした人たちがいたということがあったので、そういったような方が、自分がやってたことがもしかして間違ってたんじゃないか、その暴力に参加したこと、加担したことは良くなかったんじゃないかというふうに考えるようになってきているということがあります。でそれは少しずつそのトランプ前大統領が、選挙について嘘をついていたとか、票が奪われたとかというふうに言ってたのが実は嘘だったというふうに、それが少しずつ事実が明らかになってきている過程の中で、自分が参加していた暴力を正当化できないというふうになってきているという立ちがあるんですね。でそれがいわゆるトランプを支持している共和党の中でそういった意見が少しずつ上がってきているということがあります。でそれがやはりその反省のある人たち、疑いを持っている、不安に思っている、罪悪感を感じている人たちを少しずつ見つけて対話をしていくということが一つの、できることだと思います。これはアメリカの文脈のことなんですけれども、日本の文脈で皆さんが日々日本で暮らしている人たちが日々会っている人たちの中では、例えば安倍前総理の役割についての会話などでそのようなことが話せるかと思います。欧米のアメリカのメディアなどを呼んでいるともう本当に、世界日本に民主主義を持ってきた素晴らしい人だったというふうに語られることがほとんどなんだけれども、ソヒーさんとイサオさんの話の中では、実はそうではなかった、さまざまな問題もあった、保守的な考え方を持っていた人だったというようなことで、例えばその安倍元総理について少し、疑いを持ってたりとか疑問に思っている人たちとそういったような会話を始めていくことが一つの出発点になると思います。でコメントの中でベルフックスについてのコメントもあったかと思うんですけれども、それがまさにそのクリティカルコンシスナスの考え方で、やはり多くの人たちをその輪の中に入ってもらうということが大事だと思いますし、私が信じていることはやはり世界の中では正義の側に立っているたちの方がそうじゃない側にいる人たちよりは必ず多いと思いますし、そう信じなければやはりこの脱植民地という未来を作ることはできないので、そういったような意識と信念を持つことが大事だと思います。
ありがとうございます。Thank you so much. Yes. すいません。I'm sorry that we are actually getting pretty late here in Japan. So, ゆうさんすいません。ガナさん申し訳ないです。I'm so sorry that we have to end the Q&A session here. But since we have got like such a lot of like, some questions that we still haven't get answered, maybe like they could put the questions in the Jamboard, and maybe you could address later, LaRose, and we could share.
Sure.
What do you think about?
Can you put the Jamboard questions in a Google Doc, and then I can just answer them and send it back?
Absolutely.
Yeah, no problem at all.
Thank you so much. それでは、もしまだ質問があったりだとかですね、まだ答えられてない質問も結構たくさんあったと思うので、もしそれがある方は、これからソヒが後でアナウンスしてくれるんですが、事後アンケートですね、に答えられまだ質問がありましたらこちらへどうぞっていうふうな部分がありますので、そちらにご回答いただけると幸いです。後でラローズ教授に答えていただいた上でPTX のアナウンスメントなどでこちらにその答えがありますっていうような形でお伝えできればなというふうに考えています。Thank you so much, LaRose. Would it be possible to have final comment from you to the message to the audience, the people who participate today?
Sure. First of all, again, my gratitude to Isao, Sohee, and Mehdi for their incredible translation work and making this global community of activists possible. Thank you. We need more forums just like this to continue this work, to spread the work, to share the work, and to affirm the importance of the work. And also, I want to thank the participants for your probing and really analytical questions. It was a joy for me to engage with all of you in a very profound way. These were not superficial questions at all. Many of you already have the knowledge that you are seeking to obtain from this talk. If anything, I'm just adding to the body of knowledge that you have. So I just want to encourage you to keep reading, keep questioning, and keep forming community, because that's what we need, especially now with the rise of fascism throughout the globe, fascism and authoritarianism, and the perpetuation of coloniality. We have to come together in the same ways that these more conservative and reactionary forces are coming together. We need to do the same thing to build solidarity. So I'm so happy to be part of this process of building global solidarity. I'm honored. So I thank you, and I hope we can continue this conversation. And again, I will, when Isao and Sohee send me the Google Doc, I will answer the questions and send them back. And I look forward to future communications. And again, thank you, Mary and Isao and Sohee and everyone.
Thank you so much, LaRose. Once again, I would like to give a round of applause for LaRose. もう一度拍手を送りたいと思います。
メリーさん、翻訳をお願いしても大丈夫ですか？
いいですか？すいません。じゃあ最後のラローズさんのコメントですけれども、まず本当に功さん、ソヒさん、そして事前の準備も翻訳も含めて今日の機会を作ってくださって本当にありがとうございます。このようなやはりグローバルなアクティビストのコミュニティを作っていくということがまさに私たちが今必要としていることで、このような場ですとか、このような機会をもっともっと作っていくことによって、もっと話していって、もっと共有していって、そしてもっと再認識をすることがすごく大事だと思います。そして次にやはり参加してくださった皆様の本当にありがとうございます。本当にすごく私自身も考えさせられるような素晴らしい質問もたくさんいただいたので、本当に嬉しかったですし、皆さんからの本当に深いさまざまな今考えていることですとか疑問に思っていることをどんどん寄せてくださったということは本当にすごく嬉しかったです。皆さんやはりすでにすごくいろんな経験ですとか知恵を持っている人たちばっかりで、本当に私も話をしていくことが本当にためになりました。これからもこのような場をぜひコミュニティとしても一緒に作っていきたいと思いますし、ぜひこれからもいろんなものを読んでもらったりですとか、疑問に思ったり自分解いたり分析したりなどはぜひぜひこれからも続けてほしいと思います。やはり世界の中でファシズムですとか独裁主義ですとか、植民地主義そのものがまだ継続されている中で、このような場、このようなコミュニティがまさに大事だと思いますので、もっともっと連帯を強くしていって、このようなプロセスを一部でありながら一緒になってこれからも継続していきたいと思いますし、今日もこのような場に参加させていただいたことはすごく光栄に思っていますし、まだ時間がなかった質問などについてまた文字で答えていきたいと思いますので、これからもぜひいろいろとつながっていきたいと思います。ありがとうございました。
はい、メリさん翻訳ありがとうございました。皆様もここまで少し長くなってしまいましたが、ご参加いただきありがとうございます。少しちょっと事後フォームとそれから今後のことについてお話ししたいと思います。先ほどIsaoからもあったように、今回、質問で、時間の関係でLaRose Parris教授にお答えいただけなかった質問など、または疑問に感じたことだったり、こんなことを思った、こういうことをもっと話していきたいっていうことを、ぜひ事後フォームもしくは、質問に関しては、私たちジャムボードもこれから見ていきますので、そちらにてアップデートしていただけたらなと思います。私たち最初にお伝えしたプロジェクト複数形の未来を脱植民地化するなんですけど、今年中にまたこういった教授をお招きして、脱植民地化と、に関わるテーマですねを取り扱って、こうしたレクチャーの場であったり、もしくは、実際に、このようなイシューに関して、考える、対話なども作っていきたいと思っています。先ほどパリス教授からもいただいたように、コミュニティをね、もっとこのような対話を続けていくことが、これから、もちろん世界や日本やアジアの文脈で資本主義、それから脱植民地化、今回は、フェミニズム、それから反レイシズムといったトピックで会話をしていくことがとても大事になってくると思うので、私たちもより一層頑張っていきたいと思います。本日は、ぜひ、 お集まりいただき誠にありがとうございました。
すみません。最後に1点だけ。ちょっとせっかくなので、皆さん、もし本当に遅い時間に申し訳ないんですが、記念写真撮って終わっても大丈夫ですかね。もしカメラをオンにできる方がいらっしゃったら、ぜひオンにしていただけると嬉しいです。マガジンに掲載する際に、この写真も使わせていただきたいなと、思います。すごくたくさんの方にご参加いただいているので、1ページに収まらないかもしれないんですが、大丈夫ですかね。無理のない範囲でお願いいたします。じゃあ、スクリーン、特にポーズなどは自由で大丈夫なんですけど。So we're going to take a group photo for the event so that we can put the picture on the magazine.
Okay, great.
Okay, so I'm going to take a screenshot of the screen. So make a face or make a pose. Thank you so much. Okay, 3, 2, 1.
Yay.
ありがとうございます。
Yes. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. 本当にご参加いただきありがとうございます。これからもまた、質問の、アンサーなどに関してはまたご連絡いたしますし、マガジンの制作も、実際いろんな教授の方々にインタビューするプロセスも始めていますので、そちらも楽しみにしていただけると幸いです。本日は本当に遅くまでありがとうございました。Thank you so much for participating.
Thank you. Take care, everybody.
Yes.
Bye.
Thank you.
We'll talk, okay? Okay.
Yes, so much.
Okay, bye.